Good evening and welcome to everyone here in the auditorium of the University of Applied Art in Vienna, and to everyone who is watching on the live stream at home. I can assure you that your attendance here or your viewing is well worth it, because the book that we're going to discuss this evening, Vienna City of Ideas, Stadt der Ideen, is quite simply a fabulous piece of work by the author Richard Cockett, who you will meet in a minute. But first, I would like to welcome onto the stage Veronica Kaup-Hasler, who is the Stadträtin für Kultur, which translates into English as something like the Minister for Culture for Vienna. Veronica, please, to the stage.
Yeah, from my side, a warm welcome to everyone who made his way or her way to this room, and also to the viewers on the stream. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, it is a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this special Vienna lecture. Our guest speaker, Richard Cockett, has created an impressive panorama of a city in his book, Vienna, How the City of Ideas Created the Modern World. A city whose intellectual, cultural, and political influence reached far beyond its geographical boundaries. Vienna, the heart of the Habsburg monarchy, was more than a thriving metropolis between the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was the epicenter of a radical rethinking of science, art, and social politics. Not only did the arts and sciences from an unparalleled symbiosis, but politically, Red Vienna, das Rote Wien, as you might know it, also brought about new forms of urban life, from social housing to educational reforms and cultural policies. This era showed how political engagement and intellectual visions can mutually enrich each other. However, reflecting on this golden age of intellectual and artistic development also reveals the void created by Austrofascism and the total barbarity of National Socialism in Vienna. With a countless life extinguished by fascism or by forced immigration, Vienna was robbed of much of its identity. Thus, Vienna was not only a place of progress, but also a stage for the profound contradictions of modernity. It mirrors the dialectic that Horkheimer and Adorno described as central to Enlightenment thought. I wish you a very fruitful, enriching hour with our guests. Thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you, Veronica. Now, the way the evening is going to pan out is that later on I will be having an interview. Incidentally, my name is Misha, Glenny, and I'm the Rector of the Institute for Human Sciences here in Vienna. I will be talking to the author Richard Cockett after he has given us a presentation. But one of the reasons why we have got Wiener Vorlesung, one of the Vienna talks here this evening, is because Richard's book, which came out sometime over a year ago in the United Kingdom and the United States, has just been published here in Vienna in its German version, and a very beautiful version it is too. So before Richard takes to the stage, I would like to invite the editor-in-chief, Elisabeth Stein-Hölzel, to come to the stage to say a few words about the Austrian edition. Elisabeth.
A very warm welcome also from my side. Let me quote, "Whenever I have taken a closer look at an achievement, there has always been a Viennese at the end, or rather at the beginning," says Richard Cockett in his book Vienna, How the City of Ideas Created the Modern World. To be honest with you, as a publishing house based in Vienna, we would not have dared to bring a book with this title onto the market if the author wasn't someone from the outside, a renowned author with sufficient distance to Austrian history and Austrian sensitivities. First of all, I would like to thank Richard Cockett. It's really an honor for us that he chose Molden Verlag to be the publisher in the German-speaking world for his outstanding book. One of the reviewers here in Vienna called the book the best book on Vienna since Karl Schorske's Fin de siècle Vienna, a book from 1982, which, by the way, was republished by Molden Verlag in 2017. But I also want to thank Richard for teaching me and teaching all the other Viennese readers of his book that this city would never have been such a powerhouse of ideas without its multi-ethnic mixing, without all these immigrants coming from all corners of the empire who were eager to better themselves via educational and commercial success. So when I look at the latest election results here in Austria, to my opinion, each and every person in Austria who is entitled to vote should read this book. For a publisher, Richard's book has another wonderful benefit. There are hundreds of intriguing names and biographies in it to be discovered and rediscovered, and among them also many women whose biographies I was not yet familiar with before I read your book, Richard. You might know that Molden Verlag also publishes a series of biographies on remarkable women such as Hedi Lamar or Margarete Schütte-Lihotzky, all of them mentioned in your book. But one of these many women that I did not yet have on my list is the extremely influential social scientist Hertha Herzog, who conquered the advertising world of Madison Avenue in the 50s and 60s. So I think she might be a perfect candidate for the next woman's biography at Molden Verlag. Thank you again, Richard, for that name and that story. Finally, please allow me to mention that Richard's book is nominated for the Bruno Kreisky Award for the Political Book 2024, and it is also on the shortlist for the Wissenschaftsbuch des Jahres 2025. Fingers crossed. And if you wish, you can even vote for the book at the Science Book Prize website, which is wissenschaftsbuch.at. Have a wonderful, exciting evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. And now, without further ado, to the main event. Richard Cockett is a senior editor at The Economist, and you don't become a senior editor at The Economist without being incredibly smart. But when you read this book, you will be astonished at both the breadth and depth of his research, but also the elegance with which he presents that research. And you'll get a sense of it as he talks to us for about 35-40 minutes or so, and then I'll be in conversation with him for half an hour or so. So please welcome onto the stage Richard Cockett.
Well, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to give this lecture, and thank you also for those very generous, warm words from Elizabeth, Veronica, and Misha. I just hope you haven't oversold the subject before the lecture. You'll all be sorely disappointed. I hope not. I'm going to leave probably some of the discussion about why I came to write this book in the first place until the Q&A with Misha at the end. But I am going to finish my brief talk with a few thoughts also about what the story of Vienna, which I'm going to tell you in brief this evening, what that tells you about the history of Europe and some pointers for today. But so what I'm going to do is I'm afraid it's a big, hefty book. It would be foolish to try and give a summary of the whole thing in 35 minutes. So I'm just going to pick out what I think are some of the more unfamiliar aspects of this subject and important aspects for you. And I think that's that will do for this evening. So the title of my speech this evening is basically How Vienna created the modern knowledge economy, because I think when I make this bold claim, how the city of ideas created the modern world, that's really what I'm thinking about, because the thesis of the book, the argument running through it, is that Vienna created the way that we create and process knowledge in the modern world, and that's its fundamental importance. Now, how did this come about? Well, to begin with, we have the Vienna, which you are all familiar with, Kaup-Hasler, whose name has already been mentioned. His famous book on fin de siècle really kind of did a fantastic job of summarizing that Vienna, the glittering Vienna of the fin de siècle, the Golden Age period. And that's about 1870, 1880 to 1914, brought to a sudden, abrupt halt by the First World War. And you'll all be familiar with this Vienna, I think. This is a picture of the Ringstrasse, just outside from this building, at its height before the First World War, with these fabulous new buildings that had been built in the late 19th century to encapsulate the majesty and importance of the great imperial city, the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg Empire. And this was the city of all these famous names, Gustav Mahler, Arthur Schnitzler, the playwright, Ludwig Wittgenstein, of course, the philosopher. For the whole Wittgenstein family, there have been sort of multiple books on each one of the many Wittgenstein children and brethren. They were such a sort of extraordinary family, and the father was one of the empire's great industrialists, Karl Wittgenstein. It was a city of Sigmund Freud in psychoanalysis, and then in painting, culture, Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele, you're all familiar with, and many people beyond Vienna will be familiar with. The architects Otto Wagner, Alfred Loos, the economist Karl Menger, the great physicist Ernst Mach, from where one of the many things he did was to study how sound traveled, hence Mach 1, Mach 2, etc., when you're breaking the sound barrier. So all these great figures are fairly well known around the world. Of course, they're very, very well known here, and that's why a lot of people come to Vienna to see their Otto Wagner buildings or their and hear their Gustav Mahler concerts and see Schiele and Gustav Klimt. But I would argue that were it not for what came after that, Vienna would be much less well known and much less important than it is today, because it was after 1919, after the end of the First World War, that you had the era of Red Vienna, which lasted from 1919 to 1934, March 1934, when it was essentially militarily defeated in a civil war by Austro-fascism, and then the remnants of it were absolutely snuffed out, obliterated by the Anschluss, the arrival of the Nazis on March the 12th, 1938. So this is a very time-bounded period. It was, so what I think you have to understand Vienna's importance is you have to take the first period, the fin de siècle period, 1870 to 1914, and combine it with the period 1919 to 1934. So you have to see the two periods synoptically. And my argument in the book is that the successor generation of Red Vienna was as important as the first generation, and then in fact more important in terms of creating the knowledge economy, of applying the great intellectual, the new theories, ideas that came out of the first generation to what I call in the book the real world, i.e. real world problems of humanity. And we call this the knowledge economy. It's no coincidence that the knowledge economy was invented, the term was invented by Austrians. It was first propagated by Viennese, and the first lengthy book trying to analyze what a knowledge economy was written in 1960 by another Viennese. So the person who made it his business, who invented the knowledge economy, was Peter Drucker, the great management consultant, born in Vienna. And in fact, last week I had the great pleasure of giving a talk at the original Drucker house, where the Drucker family lived, in the 19th district. And the economist who wrote the great book on the knowledge economy, 1960, was another Viennese, Fritz Matschlup, a member of the Austrian School. And so they came from Austria, they'd seen it all at work here, and then they kind of reified it for the American market as an analysis of modern economies. So what is the knowledge economy? Well, I'll give you exactly how Drucker described this. And this is in 1960, so a long time ago here, 1968. So in Drucker's terms, what the Viennese were doing here was making knowledge productive through, quote, the systematic and purposeful acquisition of information and its systematic application. And as Drucker wrote, quote, when the intellectual says knowledge, he usually thinks of something new. And I think that summarizes Vienna 1870 to 1914 very nicely. But what matters in the knowledge economy is whether knowledge, old or new, is applicable, e.g. Newtonian physics to the space program. What is relevant is the imagination and skill of whoever applies it, rather than the sophistication or newness of the information. And what Vienna had, which made it pretty well unique, it both had the newness of information and the skill of applying it, and as well as the sophistication of applying it to new fields. And that's what Vienna did better than anybody else. So what was Red Vienna? Again, Red Vienna sadly is lost to much of history. I think very few people know about Red Vienna outside Vienna, and I've come across many people in Vienna who don't know what Red Vienna was either. So I will just a very brief summary, because it was important in the story. So this was, I argue in the book, the greatest experiment in democratic socialism of the 20th century. If you imagine Vienna in 1919, at the end of the First World War, it was a broken, impoverished country. The Habsburg monarch, had resigned. The empire had been split up by the Treaty of Versailles. Austria, the country that nobody wanted, was willed into being by diplomats in Paris at the Treaty of Versailles, and it became a rump of the empire, with Vienna, instead of in the middle of this great territorial expanse, was now stranded on the far eastern side of a very small country. From about 1919 to 22, there was famine in the city. Many of the children had to be evacuated to be fed. It relied on American aid to feed many of the children. Germany, of course, had to pay reparations, vast reparations, after the First World War, a cause for many people of the Second World War. Austria didn't pay reparations, despite bearing, in the Allies' views, guilt for the First World War, but it didn't pay any reparations because it was deemed too poor to pay anything. So the city and the country was in a desperate state. But out of this desperate state came this incredible sort of urge to rebuild the city, and indeed the human being, from scratch, for a new age, for a post-imperial, Republican, socialist, democratic age. And this was the great experiment of Red Vienna. It was nothing if not ambitious. So the mission was to apply the intellectual and cultural breakthroughs of the fin de siècle generation, what all these people have been brought up on, to create what they called literally ein neuer Menschen, which means a new human. This was the explicit aim, was to create a new type of person for the new era. And they were going to do this by applying the creativity, the intellectual breakthroughs of the first generation to the new world. And that was basically, out of that came the knowledge economy, the drive for that knowledge economy. So I want to take you some examples of this to show you what I mean. We're going to skip that one quickly. This is a very good example of what I mean. So this is a kitchen. And in fact, this is the first ever fitted kitchen, and it was designed by the first woman in Vienna to qualify as an architect here, called Margareta Schutter-Letowski. And the reason she did it was because at the end of the First World War, so many homeless, the new city council from 1925 embarked on a hugely ambitious building program. You can see the results of it still in Vienna today, to create 25,000 new homes for the working class and the homeless of Vienna. So these are the Gemeindebau, the great, what the Americans will call projects, what the English would call housing estates, which you see around Vienna today. They raised the money through a tax on middle class incomes, and raised the money and built all these new apartments. And they enlisted many existing architects, but they also enlisted the new generation of young architects and designers. And this was radical for the time because at the time, artists, designers, architects, they all worked on private houses, they did museum pieces, etc. Very few of them went near anything as commercial as public housing, let alone public housing estates. So that alone was radical. And what they needed was to make these flats, of course, they were going to be small, so they had to be as efficient and economical and easy to use as they could. So Margaret Schutter-Letowski, for reasons that I've never really fully been explained to me, she was put in charge of the domestic interior. So, in the Viennese style of the time of the knowledge economy, she applied one of the great theoretical advances of the pre-1914 age to her problem of how to redesign the domestic interior. And her particular breakthrough was to take the advances of the American William Taylor, the first person to do time and motion studies, and apply them to the domestic interior. Now, Taylorism, as it was called, is best known for its application to industrial production lines in the United States. Henry Ford, that's how they perfected the Fordism, the Ford industrial production lines. Less well known is how Margaret Schutter-Letowski took Taylorism to the domestic interior. So she really did spend a year and a half going around what used to be very crowded, cluttered, working class homes with a little stopwatch with tape measures, etc., to see how much time people wasted by walking around a house doing different tasks in different rooms, etc. So she said, why don't we put all these tasks together in one room, and what's more, join everything up in a convenient way? And hey presto, you had the fitted kitchen. And the other thing, that this could be mass-produced because all the units were joined up. And the result was this, which was revolutionary for the time. And she then went to Frankfurt. It was better known as the Frankfurt kitchen. And it became, as we all know, the standard model for housing units and kitchen units the world over from then on. And just to give you it might seem unimportant for sort of the kitchen, but just to give you an idea of how big it became in the Cold War, The Americans were very keen on the kitchen as a symbol of the advanced domesticity of the West over the Soviet comparative communist lack of interest in the kitchen economy and good living. So when occasionally in the Cold War they used to have these great trade fairs, the Russians would turn up with Sputniks, tanks, rockets, all these kind of very high grade rockets and examples of sophisticated Soviet advances. The Americans turned up with General Electric's vast fitted kitchens, basically the larger versions of a fitted kitchen, as if to show, we are the country which is interested in how people really work, what they do in the home, etc., and domesticity. And there's a famous picture of Nixon showing off one of these great kitchens to Khrushchev. So that's one example. When they travelled abroad, they took the idea with them. It was the Viennese who first applied psychoanalysis and psychology to business, thus revolutionizing business in America and Britain. Again, a couple examples of this. Two most important people. One was a guy called Eddie Bernays. Eddie Bernays was the son-in-law of Sigmund Freud, and he emigrated to America before 1914. He got interested in marketing. Business started asking him for marketing. Now, in those days, Freudianism, psychoanalysis was almost entirely unknown. When marketing people were asked by companies to find out what people thought of their products, etc., they usually did some vox pop in the streets and looked at some statistics. Eddie Bernays and the Viennese who got involved, they went and saw psychoanalysts. And there was one analyst in New York at Abraham Brill, who was a great disciple, a German disciple of Freud, who Eddie Bernays went to see. And in his most famous campaign, the campaign which essentially founded the modern marketing industry, Eddie Bernays was asked to buy a cigarette company who did Lucky Strike cigarettes. They came to him and said, "We have a problem, Eddie, where sales are going fantastically, but only to men. Women aren't buying cigarettes. How do we break into the market?" So he took the problem to Abraham Brill, the psychoanalyst. And Abraham Brill said, there's a taboo about women smoking. It's considered by men to be undignified, dirty, etc. So women are not smoking because of the men. So why don't you turn the taboo on its head? So Eddie Bernays thought, right, I'll do that. So what Eddie Bernays did was to start getting women smoking and parading them in public as a rebellion against the patriarchy. So he made cigarettes into symbols of liberation, early feminism, and independence. And to rub the point home, he called Lucky Strike cigarettes, the marketing strap was, they are torches of freedom. And in 1929, he got a lot of women to march down Fifth Avenue on the Easter Day parade, all smoking their torches of freedom. Free publicity, no need to pay for your own publicity. The pictures were published all around the United States, and of course, women's sales took off. That was Eddie Bernays. He's the father of public relations for marketing industry. Now we turn to this slide. Ernest Dichter was another one, born here. He did a lot of marketing. He did a lot of statistical studies for Red Vienna. He was employed by the city council. He had to flee, like many others, to America. He also was very interested in psychoanalysis. He was psychoanalyzed and lived on the same street as Freud himself in Vienna. He again started getting involved with business. And again, business came to him and said, how do we sell more of this or that? And he again came up, his answers were to go to a psychoanalyst. So one of his first tasks was soap. So they came to him and said, Ernest, we're not selling enough soap. How do we sell more soap? And in those days, soap advertising was very practical and prosaic. Soap made you clean. that was about it. And Ernst said, soap may keep you clean, but it does much more than that. It gives you a pleasurable experience. One of the great things about the Viennese America is that Americans were very, very prudish, and they had to be sexually and emotionally liberated, as Freud instructs us all to be. So this was his message to the Americans. So he again turned it all on its head and said, right, we're not going to say you can get clean, but we're going to make it about pleasure, about purification, etc. And this was one of his first adverts. It's pure pleasure. So it's not about, I'm clean when I get out of the bath. What he did was to invest a soap bar with emotional, sexual meaning. And that's what the straplines are. This is it's just after the Second World War. You've got no idea how many American executives were horrified by this sort of stuff in the 1940s. But the more horrified they were, the more Dichter knew that he was doing something right, because he was predicting that this sort of stuff was going to be the future. So that was advertising. Another couple of examples. One of the most famous, he's not famous, he's an Austrian architect who went to the United States, like many of them did, was a person who's now utterly unknown in Vienna called Victor Gruen. Now, Victor Gruen, another paid-up member of Red Vienna, he marched around the Ringstrasse with the young socialists, he did anti-bourgeois cabaret performances, etc., etc. But he, like everyone else, had to leave Vienna after 1938. And he, unusually for an architect again, wanted to apply architecture to shopping, to consumer habits, because that's what people wanted to do. So he started designing jewelry shops and high-end shops on Fifth Avenue. But he was also a critic of America. And when he moved to Los Angeles and the West Coast, he was horrified by these atomized suburbs in America, everyone driving around in cars, nobody to speak to each other. So his idea was why don't I apply everything I learnt in Vienna, and indeed Vienna itself, to shopping? And his solution to this was the shopping mall. And this is the first shopping mall from America in 1954. And in Gruen's own mind, and he was quite explicit about this, the shopping mall is Vienna under a covered roof with air conditioning, because usually it was situated somewhere in the desert. And what he was trying to do was to recreate the intimacy of Vienna, a place where everybody could meet, where people who otherwise would never meet anyone would have to bump into each other. So we can see here it was as friendly as possible. There was greenery, there was the benches there, the seats. It had cafes. You can just see the top of a sort of screen there. It had waterfalls. It had lots of greenery around it, as well as shops. He never lost sight of the fact that the main thing was to part with your money in shops. And this idea caught on, of course, immediately. And I would argue that Victor Gruen, this Viennese, did more to change modern urban living and spatial design in the world than anybody else, purely by the sheer number of supermarkets which now have taken over the world. Another example is this. Some of you are probably familiar with this. This is an isotype. So this was invented by Otto Neurath. Otto Neurath, to me, he was the moving spirit of Red Vienna, a fiery, very down-to-earth socialist, incredibly inventive mind, roamed over sort of so many subjects which he wrote about, lectured about, and of course applied all the theory, etc., to practical life. He built houses, he set up clinics, he did lots of sort of different things for Red Vienna. But one of the things he did was he realized that he wanted to project what Red Vienna doing to the people of Vienna. And of course, a lot of people, working class people in particular of that case, couldn't read or couldn't read very well. And so he wanted a way to give them information in an easy to read, accessible way. So he applied modern graphics, graphic art, to information, to modern statistics. And he came up, this was the result, the isotype. And again, one very simple insight. Before Otto Neurath came around, if you imagine if they were going to say, how big is the world, so he'd do a little circle like that. And then if you said, side by side, you wanted to show a bigger world, you just sort of expanded it, and you had a world like that. But he thought that was not very satisfactory because it wasn't very accurate. So all he did was to add a unit on and just do more units. So one person there represents something, and then you just do 2 or 3 or 4 more people, which shows you have 4 times as many units as you had in the first place. Very simple, but very effective. And that is the foundation of all today's infographics in the entire world. They're very sort of, and I come from The Economist, we use endless infographics, and they're all basically modeled on Otto Neurath's design. He was a big man in ideas, size, and everything. And when he came to America, they were very popular in America, used particularly for health campaigns, anti-tuberculosis campaigns in America, in the Soviet Union, all around the world before the Second World War. And he was treated like a pop star when he arrived in America, so big were these. And one headline said, here comes, as he was arriving in America, here comes the big man who invented the little man, as in his little isotypes. Many more examples. You're all probably familiar with Hedy Lamarr, the famous film star. She, of course, was Viennese. Again, another wonderful example of the product of the era of Red Vienna. She was autodidact, completely self-taught, famous as an actress, of course. Went to Hollywood in 1940, starred in lots of films, was dubbed the most beautiful woman in the world by the Hollywood studios, which was, I think, probably more of a curse than a blessing. But more importantly, she was also a great scientist in her own right, entirely self-taught in Vienna. It was her father who took her for walks around Vienna and explaining how everything worked. It was the trams, the new lighting systems, the new sewage systems, the waterways. So they would go for these long, rambling walks. And he, again, was an autodidact, but fascinated by science, would explain how it all worked. So when the Second World War started, other film stars went off to sell war bonds and war coupons. She said, right, I want to apply my science, what I learnt in Vienna, to winning the war. So what she did is she came up with a new radio frequency, which was more difficult to detect. At the time, the Allies were having real problems because the Germans could intercept particularly American torpedoes directed towards their boats, because they were directed through on a radio frequency which was very easy to detect, if you like, one line. And again, Hedy's breakthrough idea was very simple. It's called frequency hopping radio, which was just, instead of having one line connecting your destroyer to your torpedo, you hop it. You just put the frequency like that as fast as you can, which makes it very, very hard to detect, because it's moving so quickly, it's harder to detect. The technology actually was never used in the Second World War, but when it came out of patent, all the commercial applications of this became very obvious. So this is the founding technology of Bluetooth and indeed of Wi-Fi. So that basic breakthrough has created, powered the modern electronic industry. Sadly, she never got a penny out of it because it was out of patent, and she died in relative poverty, but her ashes are scattered in the Vienna woods. The economist Ludwig Mises and the economist F.A. Hayek, again, both Viennese, both working in Vienna at the time of Red Vienna. They were both critical of the politics of Red Vienna, but again, absolutely in line with the praxis of the time, applying the theoretical breakthroughs here in Vienna in economics, the business cycle. They essentially invented econometrics, applying statistics, to economics, the new free market theories, were all invented here. But what, again, Hayek and Mises were very good at was applying those theoretical intellectual breakthroughs to the real economy. So they both worked, he worked at the Chamber of Commerce, the Lower Austria Chamber of Commerce, just around the corner. And every fortnight he invited Austria's economists, called the Austrian School, to his private seminar, where they basically developed the ideas that would become known as economic liberalism, free market economics. They were incredibly influential with Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1970s and 1980s, and were honoured for that. Melanie Klein. This was a city of psychoanalysis, but also child psychology. 3 people very pioneered that. Charlotte Buller, originally from Berlin, but she educated so many of the women here. We've already also heard about Hertha Herzog. She was Hertha Herzog's teacher. The other one, which I think is very significant, is Anna Freud. I argue in the book possibly as significant as her father in terms of changing the way we view children in the legal and hospital systems in America and Britain. And this is Melanie Klein, who also had to go to Britain and was a pioneering child psychologist. Just my last example for fun. This looks peculiar. It is peculiar. This is called an orgone accumulator box, also known in America as the orgasmatron. This was the invention of a great disciple of Freud called Wilhelm Reich, again another product of Red Vienna. His great mission was to bring sexual education to the masses in Red Vienna, to banish particularly the traumas of sexually transmitted diseases, and to help with the huge mental health problems that caused in Vienna at the time. And he invented what became known as the sex pol movement, sexual politics movement, allying psychoanalysis, sex, to the modern politics of Red Vienna, to socialism. And he went off, many people, he was a peculiar character, many people felt he went off the rails. From the middle of the 1920s, he became obsessed by one theory, that the path to real class liberation was through the orgasm as a measure of your sexual potency. And to give you a better orgasm, he invented this box, which was to suck something called the orgone from the air to stimulate you. And weird as it sounds, this was incredibly popular in America. He had to flee to America again in 1940. And when you talk about the sexual revolution in America, which we all do in the 60s, 70s, the sexual revolution, the phrase, was the title of his book, Wilhelm Reich's book, The Sexual Revolution, which was written here in 1927. And all the theory of the orgone and the orgasm, that again was written here in 1926. So 30 years later, it had this extraordinary effect with what's called the Beat Generation in America. Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, Norman Mailer, they all bought or made their own orgone boxes. They were all getting in it. Every film star had one. Sean Connery was a great devotee. James Bond in an orgone box. Can you imagine? Anyway, unlikely as it seems, it's all true. And on the barricades in 1968, when the students were rioting, the Little Red Book of Chairman Mao was very popular then for revolution. But the second most popular book were the works of Wilhelm Reich, because he promised the sexual social revolution that was necessary for political revolution at the time. And that all came from what he did here in Vienna. So I'm going to explain that in a second. So just to sum up, I'll end now. I just want to say a couple of things about why was it Vienna that achieved all this? Why did all this happen in Vienna? I think 4 things to consider very quickly. First of all, as we said, it was a cosmopolitan city. It welcomed immigrants. It was a city of immigration. Most of the people in my book were born in the city, but their parents had usually moved from some part of the empire. And the empire then stretched from West Austria, which were borders now with, say, Switzerland in the west, right over to what is now, the line goes through Ukraine. So Lviv was and the kingdom of Galicia was where a lot of these people came from. Ludwig von Mises came from Galicia, as did Billy Wilder. They all came to Vienna, the heart of the empire, to better themselves. And I think that was absolutely essential because it was the mingling, the clashing of cultures, of identities, of religions. Many of them were Jews, of course, many assimilated Jews, but by no means all. There were Protestants, of Catholics from the empire, and some of no religion at all. So I think that distinguished it from every other European city. Secondly, it was a liberal city, both literally and figuratively. So it was the age of liberalism with lots of liberal politicians, fading, of course, before the First World War. But it was tolerant. So basically, people accepted new ideas and accepted it was a space to experiment, and people accepted that as part of the life of Vienna. And there was no more important person in that respect than the Emperor Franz Joseph I himself, who upheld the constitution, the liberal constitution. He took that very, very seriously. So you have, before 1914, the vision of this old man who'd been the ruler for 60 years. You know, his heyday, I guess, in his youth had been in the 1840s and 1850s. But there he was, opening the secession exhibition round the corner with all these, funky new artists ushering in modernism. And I have absolutely no doubt that he would have hated everything on display and all the artwork presented to him. But it was his duty to safeguard the space that would allow those artists to do what they did. And without that, nothing in Vienna would have happened. Thirdly, educationally, it was the German concept of Bildung held sway, self-improvement through intellectual curiosity and education. Education was taken very, very seriously, and not just for the elite. So every household, I write in the book about these extraordinary apartments with their own, everybody seemed to have their own laboratory, little zoo in their apartments. They were all experimenting on animals, age 12, and 9-year-olds would have dissecting tables in the apartment. Some people kept alligators in their apartments, etc. So, and they were all, this was a commitment to science. It was a commitment to education from an early age, and I think that was very important as well. And with that went the culture of the cafe, where people could meet, a democratic space where people could meet, the salon, another very important element of this, where people could meet, as well as the schools and university. Lastly, I think, and most importantly, I think the Viennese were very good. The Viennese ignored all barriers. So today, our education system, my education, is dominated, I think, by barriers and stovepipe compartments of education. We have humanities and science, we have business and academia, and it's the concern of many people in these compartments. Most of their life is spent policing their own little compartments. Largely, they do that by the invention of jargon, long, difficult words, which nobody else can understand, which means you can keep your subject to yourself. This was antithetical to all that this generation of Viennese stood for. And that's best represented, I think, by the university here in the old days. It only had 4 departments. It had a department of law, for legal scholars and for lawyers to train in, Department of Theology for priests, it had a Department of Medicine and Pharmacology, obviously for doctors, and it had a Department of Philosophy where everybody else went. So think about that for a minute. So if you wanted to study biology, chemistry, natural sciences, philosophy, English history, German, politics, economics, political science, everything. You went to the same department. Because the point of your education was to acquire fundamental knowledge, which then applied to all these different branches of knowledge. And when these Viennese, Bertalanffy, Hayek, etc., pitched up in Britain and America, people were amazed at their range of learning and called them polymaths. And the Viennese were a little kind of befuddled by this and didn't quite understand why they would be called polymaths, because this was their natural mode of education. They had been encouraged to roam widely. Hayek wrote a very good account of his time at the university, where he was initially he'd studied law initially, got very interested in Greek civilization, only later on studied economics. His father was a university-grade zoologist and biologist, and he was nearly going to do that. His brother became a professor of biology. And out of all that, he eventually alighted on economics and won the Nobel Prize for economics in 1974. But the key, I think, to Hayek is what informs him is his scientific methodology, his attachment to evidence-led research. And that was the praxis of Vienna at that time. And that was the praxis of Red Vienna, and that's what made Vienna such a creative place, and that, I think, is its most important legacy to the world. Thank you very much. Sorry, I've gone rather over time.
That's all right.
Do you want to look at Marilyn, or do you want to look at something else? Okay.
I never tire of looking at Marilyn.
Okay.
Richard, thank you. Tour de force. But nonetheless, it raises a lot of questions, some of which I want to put to you. First of all, I've got to say, the more I read this book, the more irritated I became, because I realized this is the book I should have written 20 years ago and never got round to it. And now you've done it.
Yeah.
I can't do it. But for the audience, it's probably a good thing, because I have to say, you know, your written style is incredibly persuasive and elegant. And even though it comprises lots of individual stories about characters, the way you're able to weave in the themes which you've been talking about through the characters is incredibly impressive. And so, as I was getting irritated reading it, the question was going through my mind: why did you decide to write this? When was the moment when you said, "This is the book beginning in 1867"? And going up, frankly, right until Mar-a-Lago and President Donald Trump to the present day.
Yeah. Well, I wrote it actually because you didn't write it, Misha, frankly. So I'd been thinking about this subject for 30 years. Originally I came here in 1987 to Vienna, clutching my Karl Schorske, and did all the kind of, Egon Schiele and the usual. Went to the Belvedere, marveled at the Klimts, and then went home. But then in the early 90s, I had a fellowship in Britain, and I wrote a book about the origins of Thatcherism and Reaganism. Where did it all come from? The intellectual history of the neoliberalism, if you like. And very quickly, I stumbled upon the Austrians, the Austrian School, von Mises, Hayek, Matschlup, Popper, Gottfried Habler. These were the people, the architects, in a very real sense, of the Thatcherite and Reaganite revolutions. So I wrote my chapters about them, and a little thing went off in my brain. Oh, that's interesting. So these guys came from the same place as Klimt and Wittgenstein and Schiele. But anyway, I left it. But then in the intervening, 20, 30 years, I've done a lot of subjects. I've written a lot. I'm a journalist and a writer, and I wrote about, advertising and marketing, modern business psychology, child psychology, more about economics. And at the bottom of it, when I did a subject, as I think Elizabeth said, you know, I would usually come to, there was a Viennese at the bottom of it. So I did a long article for The Economist on shopping malls. Oh, that's interesting. The Viennese invented the shop. Who knew that? And this went on and on. So a bit like you probably, I thought, wow, well, all these people came from one place, and at one time, that was a really interesting thing, and a lot of them knew each other. So there must be a book in here. And of course, one of the delightful things about doing the book is that having embarked on this, I then discovered vast new whole areas. I'd no idea. Sorry, it's gone. Billy Wilder was. Oh,
he was about the only one who I did know.
Oh, see, I had no idea. And Fred Zimmerman, Eric Korngold, all, you know, I had no idea they were so. I mean, if you just take Billy Wilder's Oscars, I mean, he won 16, incredible career. And if you add them all up, Fred Zimmerman, and the great producer Sam Spiegel, who did Bridge Over the Quay and everything. I mean, they were the golden age of Hollywood pretty well. Yep. So I had no idea about that. I'd never heard of Victor Gruen. So it was a huge delight going through all this and discovering all these other people. So that was nice.
But it's really interesting. We start really in 1867. And if we think back to 1867, it's a year after the Austrian Empire is humiliated at the Battle of Königgrätz by Prussia. And having always considered itself to be the superior part of the Central European world, it's suddenly number two.
Yeah.
What's fascinating is that in 1867, Franz Josef suddenly turns to liberalism. Do you know why that happens? Because that 1867, apart from the creation of the dual monarchy and so on, this is when he opens the gates to Vienna.
Well, I think if you go back a bit further, there was the 1848 revolution, and there was a brief spurt of liberalism in Austria after that, and then there was a conservative reaction against that. So I think, you know, you can already see movement, in fact, before 1867. And I think the other thing after 1867 is they're defeated militarily. So Austria the Austro-Hungarian Empire, could no longer see itself as a great military entity. So in many ways, it had to find another purpose. And so, you know, education, intellectual self-fulfillment, all this became something of a purpose. And in the book, I quote the statistics that show that, you know, Austria spent more on education per head by the late 19th century than any other country in Europe, except for Switzerland, which of course was an outlier because it had such a small, number of citizens. So in some ways, I spent it because it was shifting, and of course, you had a very successful bourgeoisie by that time who were pushing for new rights, and of course, a large part of that was a Jewish bourgeoisie. Who become newly wealthy, and they were pushing for this. So it was not only sort of the empire, the emperor letting liberalism, there was a sort of big push factor as well. And of course, the erection of the Ringstrasse outside, that was a great expression of this new confidence liberalism, that liberalism could build a new world in Vienna.
And Franz Josef, I think, to a degree, embraced that liberalism, certainly in as much that as it was projected through the Ringstrasse and the economics. But back to 1867 and the restrictions on Jewish migration into Vienna are largely lifted. Now, I know you said just now that it wasn't only Jews who were involved in this extraordinary flowering from in the late 19th century up until 34, 38. But when I read your characters, the number of times I hear the parents were from Czernowitz, the parents were from Brno, Budapest, but above all else, I mean, I think I was counting over 50% come from Galicia and from Lviv or around Lviv. And this is a really astonishing phenomenon. Did you ever come across ideas as to why you had these
it's very
hubs and centers?
Funny you were mentioning Galicia, because I was going to write another long one of the Christmas pieces for The Economist on this. I was going to go to Lviv and write the piece about the Kingdom of Galicia. In fact, Norman Davis, do you know his great book, Vanished Kingdom?
Yep.
He's got a very good chapter on Galicia.
On Galicia.
In that, with Lviv as the hub. And I think it was the urge for these Jewish families it is that urge for self-improvement and self-betterment. And, say from Galicia, from Lviv, some of them would go to the university in Lviv, but then they'd come here for further education or for a higher degree, etc. But the aim for many of them was Vienna was the prize. Vienna was the glittering prize. I mean, Lviv, I haven't been to Lviv, but I'm told it's a sort of mini Vienna in terms of many of its sort of buildings. You've been there, I presume.
Yes, I mean it's many things, including the Austrian influence is very obvious straight away. But you actually, I think you have this fascinating. You have Vienna, Prague, Krakow, and Lviv as a kind of
it's a sort of
siblings and arcing through over to Western Ukraine. But this period is interesting because you have so much going on intellectually in the arts, above all in architecture. Some of it is very positive and fascinating and revolutionary. Some of it's quite dark, however, as well. How do you account for that kind of light and dark in Vienna in that period up to the First World War?
Absolutely. So in the book, what makes, again, Vienna unique out of all the capital cities of Europe of this time is you have the two sides. In the book, I call it's Red Vienna and Black Vienna. And Black Vienna, named after the black T-shirts of the original fascists, of Mussolini's fascists. Because it was in Vienna, in Austria, and in Vienna, that the great reaction against liberalism, multipluralism, multiculturalism, and the whole apparatus of critical rationalism of Red Vienna took place. Because, of course, it was in Vienna that produced, for instance, the first anti-Semitic mayor of modern European history, Karl Lueger, who was mayor in the decade before the First World War. And he was the first politician to really weaponize the resentment felt by people who felt that they'd missed out or been relegated by the great success of the new middle class and the new upwardly mobile middle class, and that middle class was often assimilated Jewish. And the way he stitched together the coalition of people, to use a modern phrase, who felt they'd been left behind, was the glue of anti-Semitism. So he blamed it all on the Jews. And that's the first expression of modern anti-Semitism, and is well known. One denizen of Vienna at the time, living here, was an impoverished house painter called Hitler, who was born in Linz in Upper Austria, and Lueger was his model. He learned a lot of his politics from Lueger. He learned his anti-Semitism. He learned a lot of the theatre of politics from Lueger. I call him, he's the first identifiably modern populist politician. He had great attention to the theatre of politics, the processions, the way they marked his birthdays of the Führer, as he called himself, etc. So a lot of that was born in Vienna at the same time. Now, the people I talked about were very, very unaware of this, and this is the tragedy, that the two sides did not speak to each other at all. One side, Hitler, was very, very aware of the other side. The Red Vienna, what I'd call the progressive, humane, enlightened Vienna, knew very, very little about the street Vienna, the black Vienna, and very rarely came into contact with it. And scholars have tried to find points of contact between these two, but it's very, very hard. So that makes, of course, Vienna a very, very challenging place to write about and to think about, particularly post-1914, because eventually Red Vienna was, as I said at the beginning, obliterated, purposefully obliterated by the forces of Austro-fascism and then Nazism. And as I write in the book, the Nazis, the National Socialists from Germany, they were very intent on destroying Vienna as an intellectual center, precisely because it represented the antithesis of National Socialism. Here were the great scientific institutes, here was the evidence-led politics, here were all these people applying modern scientific methods, sociology, statistics, mathematics to the betterment of mankind. Eugenics is a dirty word now, but it wasn't then. They believed in positive eugenics, that it was possible to improve humans through positive environmental conditioning, giving them better housing, giving them better education, giving them better maternity service. We in Britain have a great phrase from William Beveridge, a cradle to the grave, if you like, welfare state, which would create better people and education as well. So, it was an incredibly ambitious aim, and to apply all this new science of Vienna to that. And this was the antithesis, of course, to National Socialism. That's why they want to destroy it all. And when they came here, they went about it in a very methodical manner, expelling the people, all the Jewish professors, etc., from the universities, closing down independent research institutes, etc. Many people fled, others were rounded up, some died in the death camps, etc. And Vienna never really recovered.
Yeah, we'll come on to that. I want to come on to the 20s in a minute. Although we don't have a huge amount of time, I'm still very interested. Several people have mentioned, including yourself, the Karl Schorsky book, which most people have read. What frustrated me about that book was its kind of episodic nature, and that I didn't really get the narrative. And what's really important about your book is that it's that arcing from 1867 to the present day, so that you can see the lines drawn from their intellectual origins through their initial practical application, and then the massive impact they have on the modern world. Was that something that you developed consciously as the book was going through? Was that a priori or during, as it were?
I think it was a priori and during. I shared exactly your frustrations with Schorsky. It was episodic, one essay. But of course, the Schorsky book was never written as a book.
No.
It is indeed a collection of essays.
Yep.
So there was no reason really to expect that to be anything other than episodic collection of essays. That was my frustration. And I'm a historian. I'm rather an old-fashioned narrative historian. So I decided if I was going to do this, I wanted a place to start and kind of a place to end, which becomes the 1980s, 1990s. But it's kind of you to say what you just did, because that was the biggest struggle of the book, was where to put people, was the organization, actually. There's very little new research in the book, but hopefully the positive of the book is the organization of the material, so that you can follow, as you say, so many ideas and so many people from inception to when they go abroad to their great achievements.
Although I think, just as a note for the general public, the rehabilitation of so many of the women who you write about in the book is very important indeed.
I'm not sure it mentions a woman.
It doesn't in my...
And of course, vitally, there's no scientist.
Yeah.
And so there were clearly, big lacunae there.
Just before we go on to the 20s, what was also very interesting was how many of the protagonists in your book were happy to go off and fight in the First World War. Was that a reflection of their recognition that actually the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a relatively benign empire? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was, and I do highlight in the book, a lot of these people were very patriotic and went off to fight for the Austro-Hungarian cause during the First World War, particularly assimilated Jews, because they wanted to repay the emperor for what they felt he had done for them in giving them rights of movement and civil rights. So it was repaying the loyalty that he had shown to his subjects. The contribution of some of these people to the war was extraordinary. So I give some examples in the book, but to take one of the best-known ones was Ludwig's elder brother Paul, the great concert pianist. So he was one of Vienna's great concert pianists, very, very talented before the First World War. He was badly wounded on the Russian front right at the beginning of the war, had his left arm shot off?
Left arm.
Someone's going to correct me, but I think it was his left arm shot off. And for a concert pianist, of course, this would always be a tragedy. And most people there, having had one arm shot off as a concert pianist, would probably A, think of something else to do, but B, accept that the fighting was over and he had no need to prove his valor again, go back to the front, not Paul Wittgenstein. He then badgered the army forever to let him back near the front to go and fighting, and eventually they did. Fritz Lang, the great film director, the director of Metropolis, one of the great films of the 1920s. He again was another one of these. He got injured many times, had his eye shot out. He's famous for having his sort of eye patch in Hollywood, was mentioned dispatches many times, insisted on going back. And eventually, towards the end, he was a scout, one of the most dangerous things you could be. The Austrian-Hungarian Empire, by the end of the war, had virtually no horses left, but so keen was he to continue his profession that he got his family to club together and buy him his own horse so he could go and rejoin the troops at the front towards the end of the war. So, this can only be explained by, I think, a real sense of attachment and motivation to fight for, I think for the emperor. And that's why the loss of Franz Joseph, the death of Franz Joseph I in 1916, was such an appalling tragedy, which many Viennese writers and artists, culture at the time, I would say, I was going to say never really got over, which is an exaggeration. But in fact, if you read Stefan Zweig or Joseph Roth and all these people, even Joseph Schumpeter, I don't think they did, really, because to them that was the golden era and ended really with the death of the emperor in 1916, just as much as with the end and the dismemberment of the empire in 1919, because Franz Joseph I represented to them the best of Europe, the best of liberal Europe, and the best of a real European civilization, which of course is an irony because he was an emperor and empires have gone thoroughly out of fashion. But the Austro-Hungarian Empire was very different. It's called an empire, but it was more of a territorial agglomeration, usually acquired through marriage or dynastic treaties. So it was very different from the British empires and the French empires of the time. And in the book, the last chapter, I have the this little riff that the Austrian School regarded in making the modern world economy, they constructed it rather like the old Austro-Hungarian Empire: freedom of movement of labor, freedom of information. The four freedoms of the European Union basically are the freedoms of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it was all policed at the center by the most important institution in their own minds was the World Trade Organization, which resolved disputes between the different territories and intellectual property disputes, etc. So the WTA was the emperor, if you like, adjudicating, and with everybody in a liberal sort of empire surrounding them. So it is a model for many people. It's very striking to me how it stayed with so many of these, the Viennese, right up to the end of their days.
Now, we don't have a huge amount of time, and there are two very big subjects I want to touch. There's one thing I'd say. You made the remark about nobody outside of Vienna remembers Red Vienna, and I can't gainsay that. It's perfectly true. But I've noticed since I've been living here again, I was living here in the 80s, I'm now back for the past couple of years, how we see housing specialists from all over the world trooping through Vienna to understand how Vienna, relative to other capital cities, manages to keep its rents so low. And this is a pretty direct legacy of the building of the Gemeindemauer from the 20s onwards. And so there are things which remain which aren't necessarily associated with Red Vienna today, but are in fact
they are.
Consequence.
That's one direct legacy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So Red Vienna is fascinating because it spawns the two economic traditions of the Western world post 1945. I leave aside the communist bloc for the moment. But the battle between the welfare state, a classic Red Vienna trope, and Hayek, von Mises, as you pointed out, and ultimately Friedman as well, this huge battle is fought in the United States, in Germany, and in the United Kingdom. Tell us how Vienna was the sort of the cradle of this.
Well, I mean, in the book I trace the whole modern economic debate, political debate. I trace all the way back to one single article in an academic text, which was written by Ludwig von Mises, the economist saw before, in 1920 when he was relatively young, and it was called an essay on the socialist calculation debate, which sounds rather highfalutin. But basically, by 1920 up to then, all the young people and all the intellectuals, they'd all become Marxists and socialists in the 50, 60 years since Das Kapital, etc., up to that period. And of course, we'd have the Soviet Revolution in 1917. That article was the first rational critique, economic critique of socialism and Marxism ever published. And his basic thesis that socialism and Marxism, it was a nice idea, but in practice it would never work. It could never work because it didn't have a price mechanism. That is basically the argument to today. It really has not changed at all. And von Mises, that article was a critique not of Marx or anything, but of Otto Neurath, who was the great intellectual guru of Red Vienna, who had briefly been the economic chief of the breakaway Bavarian communist state in 1919. And he had postulated this idea of a centrally planned economy and also of a barter economy where you could do away with prices. So that was von Mises criticizing von Neurath. And another person who replied to von Mises was Kaup-Hasler, who wrote a rejoinder to both Neurath and von Mises. And the person who then picked up the von Mises article and wrote about it in the London Times. He wrote a long letter, which, as far as we know, is the first time it was mentioned outside, the little academic knot of Vienna, was Friedrich Hayek in 1921. So there you have the four great figures in this debate for really the next 67 years, locking horns in 1920-21. And at that time, of course, nobody saw the significance of any of this, let alone then. But von Mises turned a generation of Fabian socialists, which is what Hayek was before he read that article, and converted them over 60 years into basically the Austrian School and neoliberalism, and I would argue roughly the shape of the world that we now inhabit in the West. So that is the significance of those Viennese intellectuals all operating in Red Vienna at that moment in time.
And the other subject I want you to grapple with, huge subject. I'll just put it in 2 words or 3 words: Vienna versus Frankfurt.
Yeah.
Explain that in terms of logical positivism and German idealism and so on.
Okay, well,
and how that plays out,
right,
particularly in the 1960s.
Thanks. So I'm going to do modern European philosophy in 1 minute. Okay, so there's in the book. I mean, this is in fact probably another book, but I think this is again an incredibly important subject. That I think Vienna was the city of the logical positivists, of applying scientific methodology to everything, including language and philosophy. And this was the origins of the great Vienna Circle, of logical positivists as they became known. Otto Neurath was a great member of the Vienna Circle. Now, opposed to them in Germany was what we now call what became known as the Frankfurt School, associated very much with the New School in Germany, and this was the school of Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, later on Herbert Marcuse, mostly again assimilated Jews from Berlin. And they represented a very different intellectual tradition. They basically argued that they were all Marxists, and that there was no point in observing the world factually through statistics, observable phenomena, which was the Austrian way of doing things, unless you admitted the class base of your observations. They were invalid unless you accepted you were from the oppressive capitalist class. And from that flowed what's called critical theory, social theory, critical race theory, in fact, comes from that school. Totally opposed by the Austrians and the Viennese. And in my book, I show how they sort of jousting against each other from the 1920s and 1930s onwards. We in Britain, we are Viennese. We are Viennese logical positivists. And I say that because...
I never knew.
And I say that because, of course, the Viennese logical positivists, they were very influenced by the British, Scottish Enlightenment, Hume, Mill, these were the most important people for them. So one of the reasons why they were received, Karl Popper and Hayek, in Britain so well, and Schomburg, etc., is that this was all very familiar, and they were reinforcing that British way of thinking. The Frankfurt School, which I'm less of a fan of, that had huge influence also in America. They co-opted Wilhelm Reich, in fact, as one of their people. But it's the clash between those two schools of thought. They are, for me, the main schools of thought, the main foundations of how we think of in modern Europe. And indeed, it's very obvious in America, too. The Viennese side is much neglected, much less well known, particularly in America. And when I talk in America, it's one of my missions, is to restate the Viennese school, logical positivism. My phrase for this is Popper's critical rationalism. Critical rationalism. And of course, ironically, of course, we must always come back to Trump these days. You know, the great opposite, of course, of critical rationalism now is Donald Trump. and the administration that now takes over in the States. So my argument is that the Viennese tradition, critical rationalism, all we've been talking about, is now actually more urgent than ever. It has to be applied more urgently and more vigorously than ever, which is why I think Vienna assumes this importance, or should assume an importance that most people would not normally give it.
Well, on that very, very positive note and almost a call to arms, I'm afraid we've pretty much come to the end of our time. But ladies and gentlemen, I have two things to say. First of all, there are plenty of copies of Richard's book out there. I see mostly in German. I can assure you it is an absolutely terrific read. Don't go home without one. And secondly, a rousing round of applause for Richard Cockett.
Thank you, Misha. Thank you so much. That's very kind. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
thank you, Misha.
You're welcome.
It's great. On time. Amazing.